All right, yeah, the others coming in can come in as they may. We'll work on that. But there are some at home who are listening, and wish I would have got an outline sheet to everybody at home. You could follow along better, but you know, if you've got a piece of paper that you can write on next to your Bible there, you can take some notes, and I try to go clear enough where everybody can follow along. What's that? I guess so. I think Mark is still in Oklahoma, isn't he, Raymond? Okay. But we're still in Mark chapter 1, so we'll let one Mark take care of the other Mark. I don't know how we'll do that. We're in Mark chapter 1, and I've got the text as verses 40 through 45, but I think actually I'll just read verse 39 again and take us on down through there. The text says, he went into all of Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. Then a man with leprosy came to him and on his knees begged him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. "I am willing," he told him, "be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. Then he sternly warned him and sent him away at once, telling him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest, and offer what Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Yet he went out and began to proclaim it widely and to spread the news, with the result that Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but he was out in deserted places, and they came to him from everywhere. You know, it almost seems like at times you can just go through the Gospel of Mark in bigger chunks, but in each one of these sections, as I break them down, I find so much in there, and it'll slow the process down of the study through Mark, but I think it's worth it. The time for that. This is another very, very important point in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is going to do three things in the next few verses to create a spirit of controversy. After this, we're going to have a couple other incidents. One of them, he's going to heal a man on the Sabbath. And if that isn't bad enough, he's going to do it by saying the man's sins are forgiven. And then after that, he's going to ask a tax collector to be a disciple. And then he's going to go to a dinner party where a bunch of other tax collectors are eating. When you read through the Gospels, and maybe particularly in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus had a habit of being with the people that those who considered themselves more important shied away from. Jesus would spend time with them. He had an ability to deal with people who would constantly interrupt and frustrate the schedules of others who were more religious and had their high horse, if you will. If you've ever been in a job where your basic responsibility is to be interrupted, you can appreciate that. And I know in my years of ministry, that was a constant thing. Don't be in ministry if you don't want to be interrupted, because people are always interrupting. Phone calls, visits, all kinds of things. And, but it's not just that. There are other times in your life where you're just going to be interrupted. If you're a parent, you know what it means. You've been interrupted over and over and over again. There are others when you look at doctors who are healing sick people. Sometimes I watch those doctors, and it's like they almost don't get any kind of a break. They're constantly dealing with people. What's sad, though, I've heard some people say the church would be a great place if it wasn't for all the sinners and sick people. And about the time you get a nice church building, you get all your programs going good, and you've got things the way you want them, lo and behold, a bunch of sinners show up and just kind of wrecks the whole program, doesn't it? So you've got to deal with that. Needy people constantly interrupt our attempt to get comfortable with our religion. I want you to think about that. Needy people will constantly interrupt our attempt to get comfortable with our religion. but that's the way it should be. Somebody said, a lot of people enter Christianity to escape the world. And boy, if that's your thinking, you've missed the boat completely. You know, we've got folks who build great big buildings out in the suburbs. Others just build great big monasteries. They want to get away from people. That was not Jesus. That's not the way he's done that. You know, I've watched a lot of our churches in the last, 3 decades or so. They have concentrated a lot on getting away from those kind of people, however they perceive them, and they move out to the suburbs and build their buildings. If it was to move out to another place for evangelism, that's one thing. If you're going to do a church plant, but just to get away from people, that's not good. That's not good at all. Yes, sir.
Francis Chan has written a number of books.
Yes, sir. And they're good.
He actually gave up covered a lot of the country ministry, the preaching position, and moved inner city.
Oh, yes. That's the most challenging work you can find is inner city ministry. Churches aren't meant to be places of respectability. They're meant to be hospitals for sick people, people who come for spiritual healing. And I want to emphasize the word spiritual. Sometimes we get detracted from that and get over some of the other things. But spiritual healing, that's what we're here for, to help people. So the next 3 sections in Mark are going to watch Jesus communicate with people who, in a sense, they were a long way from where he was, but he didn't communicate with them by long distance. He was up close and personal.
No Zoom.
What's that?
No Zoom, YouTube.
Oh, yeah, no Zoom, no YouTube. Keep that point in mind. We're gonna look at that a little bit. I'm gonna make a couple of comments, and I'm not trying to get political, but just want to look at the text and just some reminders for Christians. First thing I want you to do is notice this leper. I don't know if you've ever done much study on leprosy, but when you do a study of leprosy, it's more than a disease. It's a lifestyle of deterioration of the body. And that's really kind of sad to think about. And the Old Testament law had a lot of regulations governing how lepers could live and how they were to function in Jewish society. Matter of fact, Leviticus chapters 13 and 14 are pretty much all laws dealing with lepers. But not just lepers, it was any kind of a skin disease you could think of. And it's interesting to watch some people as they look at this text and what they try to derive from it. But I understand if it says leper, he was a leper. He didn't just have psoriasis. And a person who was a leper, he had to wear torn clothing. He had to let his hair be unkempt, kind of like mine is now, I guess. And he had to cover the lower part of his face and cry out loudly, "Unclean, unclean." And as long as he had that infection, he remained uncleansed. So it would take into account all kinds of skin diseases, but particularly a leper, as we understand leprosy. And he had to live alone. He had to live outside the camp. I say he or she, whoever had that. That was the way they were dealt with. And what's hard for us is trying to imagine a lifestyle like that. I mean, you've got to wear these torn clothes so that people from a distance are going to recognize you're a leper. When you get close to them, they're yelling, "Unclean, unclean." Or when you get close to them, because you're not supposed to let other people get defiled by what you have. And when you went home to an empty hut outside of your village. Yes, sir.
Where are you now? 6 feet.
You're getting ahead of me a little bit, but yeah, I'm kind of going there on some of that. But there's a sense in which that's applicable. But like I said, I don't want to get political. So one of the other things too is if you had a family and you contracted a disease like that, especially if it was leprosy, you had to leave them. You could only see them from a distance. Imagine not being able to hug your loved ones anymore until you were clean. And if you were a leper in the strictest sense of the word, you're not going to get to do that again. You're told to stay away from them. Now, the interesting thing to consider also is the cleansing of leprosy. The Hebrews had no cleansing for true, pure leprosy. They did not have that. In Leviticus 13 and 14, it would talk about certain cleansings for those who had been cured of some kind of a skin disease. And any kind of a creeping skin disease, that it covered that, whether it was a rash, ringworm, psoriasis, something else like that. But they would still put you outside the camp and study you until they found out what kind of a disease you really had. And every 7 days, you were supposed to come in, and if your condition cleared up after certain sacrifices, you could rejoin society. But if it was really leprosy, you're going to be a social outcast for the rest of your life. For the rest of your life. However short that life may be that's left and remaining. It's an incredible thing to consider. So with that in mind, that helps you appreciate the approach of the leper to Jesus a little bit more. Because with all of what the law said, it makes this man's approach to Jesus very startling. Because for one thing, it's an obvious violation of the law. He's not supposed to get near Jesus, let alone come up and fall at his feet and touch him. He's not supposed to do that. But even with the man's contrite spirit, he gets on his knees and he begs Jesus. And he realizes Jesus owes him nothing. That's why look at the wording on what he asks of Jesus. He's begging him, Mark says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Notice he doesn't question the power of Jesus. He questions the willingness of Jesus. Are you willing? If you're willing, you can make me clean. He believed Jesus could do it. The question is, do you really want to? Do you care enough about me to do that? Most of the people then, and I don't know about now, I haven't been around and looked very much about lepers in our society, in our world anymore, but most of the people then didn't want anything to do with lepers. And from what I've read, once you found out you were a leper, they really didn't even bother going to the priest for help, because a priest could tell you if you were clean or unclean, but they couldn't do a thing about it. They couldn't cure it in any way at all. There's a big faith statement involved here, not only for the leper, but for you and me and for the Jews back then. For one thing, for the leper to approach this carpenter with a belief that he can do what the priest cannot do, man, that's faith. That's really an incredible show of faith. Again, can you heal leprosy? That's not the question. The question is, but would you want to in my case? Would you do it for me? And so it's really quite an overwhelming thing, what's taking place here. The second thing to do is notice the response of Jesus in verse 41 and 42. I am willing, he told him, be made clean. The significance of the response is that it's a response of compassion. Jesus didn't drive the man away like somebody who had broken the law. Most people would have looked at him and said, you're breaking the law, don't do that. And speaking about some people, you think they'd have more compassion today if you don't have a mask on and they think you should. Why don't you have a mask on? Instead of saying, you forgot your mask. I did that the other day. But somebody had compassion. They didn't yell at me, and I appreciated that. And it was interesting because it was in light of the study that I had started doing and looking into this. That's pretty impressive. Jesus responds with pity with compassion. And he crosses the law in a way that's an even bigger jump than the leper did. The leper comes up and he falls at his feet and touches him. Jesus reaches out and touches the leper. And he said, I am willing, be made clean. There's some interesting things in the wording there. And I put it under the idea of the significance of how Jesus healed him. What you need to notice is Jesus touched him before he said anything. He touched him before he said anything. He's touching the man, and he's curing the man as he's touching him. You know, it's watching Jesus cross over the law and say, I'm going to identify with your uncleanness. I'm willing to do that. He risks being unclean himself or becoming unclean. But here's the interesting thing. Jesus didn't have to touch him. He didn't have to touch people to heal them. But he did. And he would always do it out of compassion. And it's interesting when you, we'll look at some examples here in a little bit. But imagine you're a leper and you're going through life, you've been going through life without any joy of human touch. I was doing some study and some reading on the importance of human touch. And it's a very valuable thing among humans. Human touch means a lot to us. You know, I've watched in church services, for example, over the years, sometimes it's hard to get people to touch one another under normal circumstances. You know, to reach across the aisle and hold hands with one another and sing a song or have a prayer. You know, there's a hesitancy. I can remember an example of me doing that years and years and years ago. Because I grew up not doing that, and after becoming a Christian, it was a new thing. But learning a different way. But having someone who, when they go home, you know, it's bad enough at church if it's going to be that way, but when you go home, wouldn't you miss the touch if it's taken away? You know, I don't know what I could do. You know, and I'm talking about a touch of compassion, not sensuality in any way at all. I read about a counselor who wrote about people who had just lost their mate. And they said the one thing they missed the most was touch. Again, not sensual touch, but just the warm, loving touch. Holding somebody's hand. Putting an arm around somebody. You know, you get used to being close, and the longer you've been married, the more important you realize what touch means. My father-in-law lost my mother-in-law a couple of years ago. And when I talk to him, he just misses the little things where they would sit and, you know, and they could tap each other on the arm, hold hands, just watch a little TV show together, something like that. Touch is a language of compassion. And it's a primary means of spreading compassion. You know, somebody's hurting real bad. I've watched when we had people come forward here over the weeks. You know, we gather up around them, and I've watched you particularly, how you'll put your arm around Raymond or some of the others, you know, the compassion. You don't have to say anything. It's the touch that reaches out that's so important for all of that. Somebody said to touch can be to give life. And I think that's right. But imagine having to live your life and people won't touch you, especially your loved ones, because they're more afraid of violating the law. There's a movie I really like, and there may be 2 or 3 things there you might object to. It's not really bad. The movie is called The Kingdom of Heaven, and it's about the Crusades. And it's based on some truths of history. King of Jerusalem at that time was a leper. And his sister remembers him when he was young. She said, when you were beautiful. But she still loved him. But to touch, you just didn't do that. You just didn't do that. Jesus touches the man. And the only way I know of to explain it is, it's compassion. But I think there's also an object lesson he's teaching you and me. I think Mark is trying to show us that Jesus is touchable and he's willing to touch. And if the master's that way, his disciples should be as well, shouldn't they? They should be that way, in the same vein. I wonder sometimes if in this modern age, if we really understand how important that is. Read through the Gospel of Mark, and one of the things you're going to find is Jesus letting people touch him. When we get to Mark chapter 3, it's going to say all the diseased people were brought to Jesus, and Mark says, so they could touch him. No, it says so he could touch them. So he could touch them. When you move over to Mark chapter 5 and verse 27, it's a story about a woman who's had an issue of blood for 12 years. Hasn't been able to stop the bleeding, a hemorrhage. And she's definitely unclean according to the law. And yet Jesus lets her touch him. Well, touch his garment. But she's not even supposed to get that close. And when she did this, he doesn't turn and rebuke her. He says, your faith has saved you. Oh, and I'm looking forward to getting to that story. That's powerful in and of itself. In Mark chapter 6, in verses 53 through 56, it says all the sick in the marketplace were being brought to Jesus so they could touch Jesus. Touching Jesus and being touched by Jesus. Yes, sir.
Over in chapter 11, about the last verse, the doctors and the lawyers asked Jesus, what authority do you have to teach us these things? And he refused to give them an answer.
Well, I think there's a reason. One of the reasons, well, probably several reasons. One of the reasons for it is there were certain signs, and you can go look them up in Jews for Jesus and folks like that. They deal with that. There were certain signs that the Jews believed Messiah could do, and only Messiah. One of them was raise the dead. One of them was heal a leper. And so when those things took place, and Jesus would say, go show yourselves to the priests. One of it was to show that the man is clean, and show the priest that, but the other one is to tell who cleaned him. Who cleansed the man? He's Messiah. Because nobody can cleanse a leper except God. So, that's one of the reasons why Jesus got to a point where he wouldn't even answer them. You've had the signs. You refuse to believe and follow along with them. One of the interesting things that I find as a preacher is I don't know that any preacher of Jesus' day would have dared touch a leper. They're somebody who's supposed to know the book, and let sick people touch them, especially lepers. No, that's not going to happen. But Jesus did. Jesus did. I tell you what, I've been around some people, and some of the stories that I've learned over the years, very, very humbling if you're really going to follow in the steps of Jesus. But the Bible is filled with all kinds of teachings about Jesus and his compassion, and it's one of God's main attributes. Back in Exodus, let me see if I can get there real quick. Exodus chapter 33 and verse 19. This was a keynote verse for the Jews. And you'll find through the Old Testament where a part or all of it is quoted and repeated often, over and over. The Lord is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin. But he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the father's iniquity on the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. But it starts off with, here's what you need to know about God. He is a compassionate and gracious God. A very, very important characteristic of God. When you read through the Psalms, the psalmist will repeatedly draw attention to the compassion of God. And so Jesus, like his Father, is compassionate. And is God on earth in a human form, showing what God's like and what he expected his disciples to be like. Show compassion. Matter of fact, you look through the New Testament, you find Jesus with different characteristics of compassion. Look over in Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. And we're going to look at verses 13 and 14. When Jesus heard about it, he withdrew from there by a boat to a remote place to be alone. When the crowds heard this, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them and healed their sick. Jump up to Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20 and verses 30 through 34. There were two blind men sitting by the road. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." The crowd demanded that they keep quiet, but they cried out all the more, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." Jesus stopped, called them, and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Lord," they said to him, "open our eyes." Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes. Immediately they could see, and they followed him. Mark chapter 6 and verse 34 that we've already made mention of. He fed a great crowd. He looked on them like sheep without a shepherd and had compassion on them. Jesus was not repulsed by people who wanted to touch him. He was not afraid to touch the untouchables. He was not afraid to do that. And this is not the only time he heals somebody by touching them. Yes, sir.
The point I find interesting is these various people know that Jesus is who he is when the Pharisees, priests,
Oh, yeah.
and stuff recognized it.
Boy, it's so tempting to have a political statement, but I'm not going to do that. Mark chapter 7. Yeah, you're right. You're right. You know, the people who want to accept the truth for what it is, accept it. In Mark chapter 7, a man's deaf and dumb, and Jesus touches his mouth and his ears to heal him. In Mark chapter 8, you've got a man who's blind. Boy, that's going to be a beautiful story when we get to it. It's the only place where Jesus had to do a miracle twice, or has two steps to the miracle. And we'll save that for later. But he uses saliva and rubs his eyes, and he doesn't have to heal the man that way. But I think Mark's trying to convey to us that being touched and touching communicates something about himself that just speaking wouldn't do. You know, James talks in James chapter 2 about telling people, be warm and be filled, when you can reach out and touch them and do something for them. It makes all the difference in the world when you have that compassion. And you know, John chapter 1 verse 14 says that Jesus was God become flesh. Well, that's the way God is. People who want to badmouth God and say he's not a God of compassion, they haven't read their Bible. But it says something to us as Christians about the importance of compassion. There are some implications that we need to look at. For example, if all of humanity only needed to hear truth, it would have been handed down from heaven, if that's all they needed. But what God sent from heaven was truth in flesh, so that it could be touched and held and take on a personal meaning for all of it. One of my mission trips when I went to Romania several years ago, we would always go to an orphanage. I made 3 trips over there with a group. One of the trips, I remember we went to an orphanage. And you couldn't believe it until you got in there and saw it. There were fleas everywhere. They had dogs running around and there were just fleas. There were fleas all over the kids. They couldn't do anything about it and get them out. And we went in there and sat down, the workers. Not a single one of us did not leave without some flea bites and taking some fleas off of us. When we got back, we showered and things, but if you were going to be among them, those things are going to happen. And we understood that's the way Jesus was with people. And to see these little orphans like that, and to not want to, and they wanted so much to touch you. How could you not do that? And if you're going to be like Jesus, you have to. And that's why we get to this place now about our pandemic. It's telling us and wanting us not to touch, not to be personal with people. And I just don't get it. And it wants us to worry about, keeping our laws. And I wonder, how would Jesus handle all this? How would he do that? You were going to say something?
You say Jesus risked all these things. I don't think he risked anything. He could tell the police to go jump over.
Yeah, more than likely, we think in that term.
And he tells us if we have faith, we can do the same thing.
I had a teacher one time when I was in preaching school, and he taught the Gospel of John, and he blew me out of the water. He started talking about how human Jesus was. And he would look at us and he said, fellas, Jesus had body odor. His feet stunk. He didn't walk 6 inches off the ground. He walked in the dirt and things like everybody else did. And I sat there and I remember looking at him thinking, wow, I'd never thought of that. He said, I want you to see how human Jesus really was. And so I don't know about all the other things. I just know he was human and he identified with us in all of our weaknesses. I want you to look at what happened. The result of all of this, verses 43 through 45. He sternly warned him and sent him away at once, telling him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer what Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. Yet he went out and began to proclaim. Once again, we watch Jesus heal somebody, and he tells them not to tell others. And this is early on in the book. The question comes up, why? Why would he do that? You would think he'd want him to go and tell people about who he is and stuff. I think one of the reasons that Jesus didn't want him to go do that is he's following what the law required. Go to the priests. That's what the law requires. You need to be ceremonially clean. He's not going to break the law for that. I cleansed you, but, go show the priests. Because he's still not going to be able to participate in Jewish society until the body of priests who declared him unclean declare him to be clean. And he's considered that way. I think another reason is Jesus wants the priests to see what's taking place so they can make a decision. He said it'll be a testimony to them, and to them, the priests. We talked about this earlier in the lesson. There's evidence there. A leper has been cleansed. What does that tell you? Well, a leper's been cleansed. Yeah, but who cleansed him? Well, who's the only one who can cleanse a leper? God. Who cleansed him? Jesus. What does that mean about Jesus? Wow. It makes me think about a lot of these folks who want to argue that Jesus really wasn't deity. They need to go back and study their Bible more. Look at it a little bit more closely. That's exactly what Jesus is saying. When John was in prison, He sent some of his disciples to Jesus to ask, "Are you the one?" And Jesus said, "Go back and tell John, among other things, lepers are being healed." Ah. So when John would hear that, John would say, "Okay, you are the one. You are Messiah." The others should have seen that too, if they were that serious about God's word. You know, when you see something in God's word and it goes against everything you've traditionally held to before, and it seems so new that can that really be true? If it's true, why would you reject it? We're to be seekers of truth. They were to be seekers of truth. Anyway, but maybe the most important thing was for the leper to go out and start proclaiming is going to hinder the ministry of Jesus. You know, we pointed out last week in the lesson that Jesus said his ministry was preaching. That's what he came to do. And going out proclaiming what a healer he is and what a wonder worker he is, you know, he's, he does the sensational, but he's not into sensationalism. It's a serendipity of what his priority is. He came to preach. Yeah, exactly. So we may go to the next towns and preach, for that was why I came. It also presents a paradox about Jesus. Watch this. He'll heal the sick, but he doesn't go out looking for the sick to heal them. That's kind of interesting. You know, people say, well, Jesus is a healer. We've got modern healing. That wasn't his purpose. That was a serendipity to what he did. He'll feed the hungry, but the next day he'll rebuke the hungry because all they wanted to do was follow him for the bread. You've got to see him for who he is and what he's here to do.
So if he heals person here, person there, that's all I do, healing person here, person there. Whereas if he could preach and teach us what he came to teach us, then the whole world is healed.
Spiritually.
So I think that's, which is what's important.
Yeah, the spiritual healing. Yeah.
And I think that's why he wanted to stay away from the sensational, because if he's busy, he can only do,
That's all he's going to be caught up doing.
so many,
Yeah.
right? But if he can preach and spread the word, he reaches so many more.
One of the texts we're going to look at, Mark says he spent all day healing sick and working with them. And then after a while, he's got his disciples and said, we got to go off. They go off and pray. They stop the healing process. That's not what he was here for. What he did was sensational, but he didn't do it to be sensational. He did it as an object lesson for why he was really here. And so when you watch Jesus, he comes to preach, but he's so frustrated when his message gets hindered. And sometimes you kind of want to ask, well, if that's what's hindering your message, why are you doing that? Because they're credentials as well. What he's doing offers credentials as to who he is and why he's here. That's it. He also has that godlike characteristic, compassion. One of the interesting things to me as well is the man goes off and does exactly what Jesus said not to do. And it reminds us that disobedience, even with the best intentions, can hamper the work of Christ. And we'll do some things that we feel like are good, but Jesus really didn't call us to do that, but we're doing it in the name of being like Christ. And sometimes we can end up hampering the real work of what we're called to do.
These days is one of the concepts in journalism today that really hurts me is when so-and-so has revealed information on a condition
Anonymity.
that
Yeah.
because you get in trouble otherwise.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to say it. Shut up.
Yeah. It's interesting here. Someone pointed this out to me, and I thought, that's really good. Jesus told the leper, don't tell anybody, and he went out and told everybody. He tells us today as Christians, go out and tell everybody, but you fill in the blank. And that's rather convicting, isn't it? Wow. Today I watch us, and I think we get more intent on feeding people physically than we do spiritually. And we tend to go to extremes. You find groups of Christians who all they're going to do is they're not going to do all these pantries or helping out. They're just going to preach. Or they go to the other extreme and they never get around to telling the truth about what people need to hear, and all they do is just feed them things. There's a middle ground that takes both. You know, it's good to help people. Galatians 6:10, that's what Paul said to do. As you have opportunity, do good to all men, but especially those of the household of faith. Do good to them. But, let them know why you're doing it. Letting them know what they should do to respond to all of that. If we never get around to the message of Christ, we really haven't done very much good for anybody, have we? We need to get around to letting them know what the truth is. So, but somebody said also, that's what happens when you try to reach out and help those who are untouchable. They're going to be so gracious and so appreciative of what you do. That's how they're going to respond for those things. Others are going to say, well, you get involved with those kind of people and you get nothing but frustration, because if you have to help one, you're going to end up having to help 1,000 of them. Yeah, where's the problem in that? I haven't seen the problem. That's an okay thing to do. If you think that way, boy, wait till we get to the next two stories about Jesus and what's involved there. Jesus never let an experience with an untouchable become so frustrating he wouldn't minister to untouchables. But I think we've done that sometimes. I've watched this in the church over the years, and we're not sure how to deal with single people. We're not sure how to deal with divorced people. We're not sure how to deal with people who have a drug background or who have been in jail. We're not sure how to deal with people who are unwed mothers or have a mental history. And goodness gracious, if we talk about dealing with homosexuals or prostitutes, can we do that? Oh, but even worse than that, I think the modern day leprosy, anybody know what the modern day leprosy probably is? Well, yeah, there would be that, but I was thinking AIDS. The way and some of the arguments that come out about that, oh my goodness. Surely you can't touch them. You'll get it. I just do what Jesus called me to do, and we're going to be okay. I'm not sure about all the outcomes, and I don't understand those things. One of the biggest problems in dealing with those who are untouchable is the same thing I said a while ago. We end up at extremes. Lots of feeding, no message. Lots of message, no feeding. Middle ground. Middle ground is what we need. And I really think the biggest reason for that is our ignorance of God's word and our selfishness. And you'll hear me say it more than once. I think those are the two biggest sins in the church. Those are the two biggest problems in humanity. Selfishness and ignorance of God's word. Minimize that and watch what that does for the rest of us. God didn't call us to judge folks. He called us to minister to them. He's the one who sits on the throne there and decides those other things about morality and stuff. We don't condone bad behavior, but at the same time we understand those with bad behavior need help. They need to be cleansed. Yeah, every single one of us. Interesting thing, I found over the last few years that if there's one thing we need to do a lot more study on, it's the idea of holiness. With holiness, I find on the one hand, what we understand is that means you're set apart from the world. You're called to be God's holy ones, to be saints. Yeah, that's true. But the word holy also means you're set apart to do God's service and God's work the way He wants you to. He pulls you out and puts you to work. All of that encompasses the idea of holiness. And I don't think we're to abdicate our moral responsibilities in any way, shape, or form. But I do think, we're to be concerned about people who need compassion and be concerned about Christians being compassionate. When we do that, then we have more of an understanding of what's going on. Boy, there's so much to go with on that, and I don't want to do that. What I do want to do is to realize there are some principles that will help us be more compassionate. Let me share those with you, and we'll wind the lesson down. Principle number one is this: it's easier to believe in God's power than in his mercy. I've watched people think, God can do anything except forgive my sins. Because if you only knew what I had done and what I had been, well, God already knows that, and he's still willing to forgive. When the Apostle Paul tells Timothy, I was the chief of sinners, he's not exaggerating. And he said, but God had mercy and forgave him. The leper says, I know you can, I just want to know if you're willing to. And that's the way we are with God sometimes. I know you can forgive, but will you? Do you want to? And I think that affects us negatively as we reach out to others. I don't know if God can forgive that one or not. The only sin that God cannot forgive is the one you don't give to him. That's the only unforgivable sin there is. Because it questions the truth of God's word and God's power. He can forgive anything, and he's willing to, but you got to let him. It really is. Do you mean you know more about your sin than God does? Do you mean you're more powerful in dealing with your sin than God is?
You're the first person in history that done it.
Yeah. And goodness, since I've done it, I have to be the worst. Go back and read the Bible. Go back and look at who God dealt with. Are you willing? Yeah, he's more than willing. I heard about a fellow who flunked out of a major university. And he was so embarrassed and ashamed, he went to live in the attic of a church building for 4 years. And the only reason he got found out was he'd come out at night when nobody was around, and they had a refrigerator, and he would sneak in there and find something to eat, or he'd sneak out and get something, quickly come back and go back up in the attic before it was daylight, kind of like a vampire, I guess. And he finally was down there one night looking, and somebody heard him because they happened to be in the building. And he was so embarrassed. Why? You didn't do anything worse than anybody else has done. And we've got people, even in the church, who are like that. They're so burdened by the past, they don't know how to deal with it. They can't get rid of it, but they won't bring it to God and his people. I love watching, that's one of the things I love about this little church, is how accepting we can be of other people and reach out to them and just love them. It's an amazing thing. All of us, if we'd admit it, we know people who have had sexual misconduct, drug problems, alcohol problems, legal problems. Man, I don't think the church would even hire the Apostle Paul when they found out he'd been in prison. I don't know if they'd do that. It's amazing how we think. But when you think you're not good enough, you better think again. Nobody is good enough. That's why we need God. That's why we need mercy and compassion. And that's why we need to be givers of mercy and compassion. Secondly, it's easier to judge than it is to minister. It's easier to judge than it is to minister. We're not saved on the basis of personal goodness. We're saved on the basis of God's willingness and our obedient response according to what his word teaches. That's what we do. When untouchable people come into our lives, and if you're really going to be like Jesus, they will. They will come into your life. We have to make a choice. Do we judge them or do we minister to them? And if we judge them, we render ourselves as not being worthy enough to minister to them, because we're not going to. If we determine to minister to them, we're going to let God take care of the judging. We're just going to hand out mercy and compassion where we can, as we can. What they do with it is up to them. It's their choice. I heard about two social workers who went into a ghetto. Two ladies, and they came on a child who was playing in the dirt, just filthy. And one of the social workers had a kind of a high tone, and she said, "Why doesn't somebody clean up that child?" And her partner responded to her and said, "You know, that child's mother loves the child, but the mother doesn't hate dirt. You hate dirt, but you don't love the child because you don't love the child enough to help out. When somebody comes along who hates the dirt and loves the child will get cleaned up." Oh, dawns the light. That's how it works. Yeah. You don't condone the behavior, but you need to be willing to help out. I hate dirt, but I love the souls. And thirdly, it's easier to talk than it is to touch. When you talk, you can be a long way from people, like Zoom and a lot of other things. And it's okay to do it like we're doing it, to have people at home and we can teach them. But if we confine ourselves that way, when the opportunity comes along, it's time to get back among God's people and to get back among people, period. Those of us who care enough about a job and making money and providing an income, boy, we're going to get out among people then. Well, spiritually should be more of a priority. What Jesus does in the Gospel of Mark, somebody said, is put his mouth where his life was. And I had to think about that one a minute. He said, yeah, that's right. He said, I didn't say put his life where his mouth was. Put his mouth where his life was. He got out, helped people, and then he spoke. You got to have that life working there and then the mouth, to share something good. We live in a time where social distancing is the norm. It's insisted on. And touching is a thing to be avoided. I really wonder how Jesus would approach our situation today, what he would do. But you see, here's the point. Compassion comes at a price. It's not free. I heard about a lady whose car had stalled in one of those West Texas gully washers. Water's running like 18 inches deep. And this preacher said that a friend of his had a big old truck and he pulled around. She'd gotten out of her car, rolled up her pant legs, and was trying to walk across that water. She's an elderly lady without being pulled away by the current. And he yelled out his window and said, "Ma'am, can I help you?" And she said, "Not from there." Not from there. And sometimes we do that. You can't help from the building. You got to get out of the building. You got to get out of yourself and do that. I worked for a church that insisted I stay in the office at least 6 hours a day. I was guarding the secretaries. I wanted to get out among the people and try to teach Bible studies, but they thought that was more of a priority. Consequently, very little evangelism got done. We want to help people. We say we do, but we like staying where we are and being comfortable. If you're going to love, like Jesus means to live a life that's not self-protective, because you can't express compassion very well from long distance. You can promise it, encourage it, but you can't really deliver on it. You need to be close enough to reach out and touch someone. And I hope maybe in this lesson there's been something for you to help you a little bit more as you minister to others and follow Jesus. Don't compromise your standards, but reach a balance where we don't insulate ourselves from people either. There's a mixture there. We need to heal lives but not be infected by the filth. We're in the world, but we're not of the world. but we are in the world. Let's help the world while we're here. Thank you, and God bless you. And have a good week. Yes, we should.